everybody to my reading and signing of Maripi Moon Book 1, Caparina. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the book and the series before we get started. Unlike my Hereford Grange series, this one is young adult science fiction. And when I say young adult, I don't mean that it's just for kids or teenagers. It's really for anybody who just loves adventure and science and a good, clean story. But it can be read by someone 13 and up without having to be embarrassed. So I've had a lot of people asking about Maripi. What does Maripi mean, and where does that come from? So the word Maripi comes from the Spanish word for butterfly. Come on. Which is mariposa and mariposa. And so when I learned that word a long time ago, it kind of stuck in my mind, and I just really thought it was a pretty word, and so I came up with Maripi to describe all of the creatures in my book who maybe are not quite creatures, but you'll have to read to find out. So the character that you're going to meet in the very beginning, the main character whose point of view goes throughout the entire book, her name is Celeste, and she starts out as 15 years old, she ends as 17 years old. So in our world, she probably would have been about 2 years older, but everything in their world happens at an earlier age. So they graduate at 16 and start their life at 16. So it's kind of it's speeding everything up for all the young adult readers. So the world in these books is completely made up. It's not a planet or anything that you've heard of. It's just completely made up in a galaxy not even far away. It's just totally made up. And it's in the center of a star cluster. And when I first came up with that idea, I was at it was a long, long time ago. I was at the Creation Museum up in Kentucky, and we were watching the astronomy video in the observatory thing. And I cannot remember the name of what that's called, where you watch it and you're looking up at the ceiling. But we were watching that video, and they were talking about star clusters, and I thought it would be so cool to write a story set in a star cluster. And it took about 4 or 5 years to do that, but it eventually decided that would be a pretty cool place for this story. So as far as the background goes, I'll be happy to answer any questions that y'all have later. It's way too much for me to explain before the reading. But it's set on a moon that's in the center of this cluster that's orbiting a gas giant called Azura. And so Azura kind of acts like their sun, and the moon is a lot like Earth. And then on the moon, there's a colony, and everything in the series is set within this colony. And as I kept writing books and kept coming up with ideas, the colony kept growing and growing and growing, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to have about 8 books in this series. So we'll see. I'm editing book number 3 right now, so we shall see. Alright, so in this series, you will find science, history, romance, adventure, and mystery, and that's all of my favorite things thrown into one book. I love science fiction, and I really struggled to find clean science fiction that didn't have curse words or sexual scenes and stuff in it, which I don't care to read, and so I've just decided to write my own. So we'll get started on reading. So when I was looking for what I was going to read, I decided to skip the first 2 scenes because they're sort of explanatory world-building scenes, and instead I'm jumping right into some action in the 3rd scene. So here we go. Celeste waited until an hour after the lights were out to head to her place, a small camp she had made in the jungle near her home. She kept her slender body low as she crossed the expanse of open land between their home's rear air shaft and the dense overgrowth of the jungle. Lights in the distance told her the night guards were on patrol again tonight. Once in her place, she cleared some of the fallen leaves which disguised her handiwork and sat down. Her eyes were burning again, but the warm night air seemed to help. She pulled her lamp out of her backpack, along with her journal. It was tricky business getting the brightness just right. She didn't want to know what the night guards might do if they caught her. She flipped back a few pages from her bookmark and reviewed her notes and drawings. She had finally finished mapping the night sky. Even though the bright blue gas giant Azra blocked most of the galaxy's star cluster by midnight, some of the distant stars were still visible. A few more pages back, she reviewed her map of the core, or at least all she knew of it. It was impossible, she suspected, to map all of the winding tunnels and unmarked rooms which branched off of the corridors. She took a deep breath and turned back to the bookmark. Her next assignment was to finish her map of the area surrounding the core and the jungle. She'd learned in school that the eastern jungle extended further than she could go in just a few short hours before it ended at the sea. As for the other directions, she knew they were pretty vast too. Okay, map, where to tonight? She said, running her fingers over the page. A faint glow emanated from a spot to the north of the core. It was a long walk, but she knew she would have time. She packed up her things and felt to make sure her dagger was safely in its leather sleeve at her hip. Even though the jungle was thought to be safe near the core, she wasn't taking any chances. The jungle floor was thick with dead leaves and fallen branches, making the going slow, but her thick boots protected her feet from the thorny vines. After 15 minutes, she stopped. Blocking her path was one of the jungle's huge trees, fallen during a recent storm. She looked both ways, but she could see neither the top nor the roots of the tree. It was at least 90 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. She placed her gloved fingers into one of the deep crevices between the bark and pushed up in another with her foot. She crouched on top of the log and surveyed the path ahead. A few little creatures scurried about, but all else was quiet. She dropped silently to the jungle floor. She cringed a little when her feet hit the ground. She was still sore from practice tracks today. The instructor had added an additional 10 laps to the normal 20. He said it was the head administrator's orders, but Celeste suspected he liked seeing them hurt. Physical ability was important in the Corps, so much so that 3 hours of each school day were dedicated to strength, agility, and endurance training. Each student had to be ready for whatever job the council chose for them. After about an hour, she neared the spot the map had indicated. She paused behind a tree and surveyed the clearing up ahead. Large metal frame domes randomly dotted about a square mile of the surface. Warm, yellow light filtered through glass panes. Now what do we have here? She whispered, her curiosity growing by the second. She pulled out her journal and sketched the plane in each of the domes. One of the domes on the map glowed. She looked around. None of the night guards were visible, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. She narrowed her eyes at the map. You want me to go out there? What if I get caught? The dome on the map glowed more brightly. Fine. I'm beginning to think you don't really care about me at all. She shoved her journal into her backpack and crouched low to the ground. The map hadn't asked this much of her before. Maybe she shouldn't trust it. She willed herself to be as small as possible and crept out onto the plain. The dome indicated on the map was about a quarter mile away. Celeste avoided the lights from the other domes, even though she was dying to look into each one of them. She was about to peer into the specified dome when its light died. She glanced around in horror. Had she been caught? She breathed out slowly. No one was around. She waited for a while, but the light stayed off. Slowly, the lights in the other domes flickered off. She glanced up at Azura. It was after midnight. She needed to head back. She sat down and pulled out her journal. The light on the map was gone. I guess I failed you tonight. I'm sorry. The page shimmered acceptance. Thankfully, it was pretty forgiving. She hurried back to the air shaft, stashed her backpack and dagger, and fell into bed, exhausted. As the assembly on the morning before the advancement ceremony wore on, Celeste's anticipation grew. Not only was tomorrow her 16th birthday, but it was also the day she would become an official citizen of the colony. She would receive her apprenticeship placement and begin her grown-up life. Needless to say, it was a very special day. Results of the previous week's tests were posted in the hall along with the current eye color data. Even though she had spent her allotted hour in the maturation chamber, like all of the other brown-eyed students, she was the only one who didn't see any changes. However, since she would be 16, she would graduate, eyes gray or not. It wasn't always like that, her mama said. They used to wait until 18 or even 20 before they allowed a brown-eyed student to graduate. Not that it came up all that often. Unfortunately, she said, a growing population in the Corps meant that workers were needed at a faster rate than natural maturation would allow. Celeste was glad this was the case. She was one of the smartest in her class, and she couldn't wait to get out of school and onto her placement, which would be prime, of course. Her test scores were the highest on the roll. If all this wasn't enough cause for excitement, they had just announced a grand festival this year to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the education program. The festival committee had begun decorating the central hub, gathering hall, and grand dining room for the occasion that morning. Celeste and the other students filed silently to the cafeteria where a not-so-special lunch had been prepared. Steamed moonfish and green salad, sans dressing. She bit her lip to stop from gagging. She hated moonfish, but under the watchful eyes of the monitor, she had to eat every bite. She had learned long ago to ration the salad so that each bite of moonfish was tucked in between its leaves. Thankfully, they never told them how to eat their food. At least that way it was bearable. She blinked her eyes. Were they on fire this time? She rubbed them gently, and the sensation passed as she blinked again. Suddenly, the student across from her screamed, causing Celeste to drop her fork with a loud clang. A cold chill slid down her spine when she met the girl's wild eyes. Before either could speak, one of the monitors clamped her hand over the girl's mouth, while another hooked her around the chest. She went limp and was carried away. Her tray was removed and seat replaced immediately, as if she had never even sat there. A voice came over the loudspeaker. Keep silence. It was the head administrator. If anyone had been tempted to share in the girl's mysterious hysteria, that temptation would have vanished instantly. However, the girl was gray-eyed and very level-headed, not the type to lose her cool. Celeste stared at her half-full plate. Was she being paranoid to think it was because of her? Lunch was dismissed on time, but as she followed the line outside, she noticed how little the other students had eaten. Even the monitors seemed shaken, since they hardly perceived the students walking past them as they cleaned the tables. She slipped into the empty washroom and stared at her eyes in the mirror. She barely heard the warning bell. Purple? She ran to the nurse's office, but the door was locked. She knocked frantically, but no one answered. She almost knocked again, but the sound of voices stopped her. Why did you disrupt lunch today? Asked a monotone voice. The girl replied through broken sobs. Celeste's eyes, they're purple. A zap made Celeste jump. The lights in the hall flickered. You disrupted lunch today. This time the girl replied in a stunned monotone, and it was broadcast through the loudspeakers. Celeste shivered as she listened. I, number 19, wish to apologize for my lack of self-control and beg the forgiveness of the head administrator, the monitors, and my fellow students for the interruption and distraction my disobedience at lunch has caused. Footsteps moved toward the door. Celeste hurried to her classroom and sat down as the bell was ringing. No one mentioned Celeste's eyes for the rest of the school day, causing her to hope for the first time in her life that they had reverted to brown. Just steps from freedom, the head administrator's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. All the students froze. Attention, number 53 to room 11. Celeste about-faced as the word 11 reverberated through the hallway. Her pathway cleared as the other students turned their bodies to the walls in shame. She wished her hand would stop shaking as she turned the silver knob. The nurse was standing by a small table, a set of examination tools spread before her. She motioned to the chair in front of her. Without pause, she picked up a small light and shined it in both of Celeste's eyes. She wrote something in a notebook. She held a silver implement up for Celeste to follow with her eyes. She wrote something down in the notebook. She put a couple of irritating drops into both of Celeste's eyes and repeated both of the tests. She wrote something else in the notebook. Then she pointed to a small cot in the far corner of the room. Celeste blinked frantically and stumbled over to the cot. Eye drops had never hurt before. She closed her eyes as the pain increased. She longed to lie down, but she feared the repercussions. Moments later, she blacked out. Okay, and with that is what I was going to read today. So if you want to find out if Celeste ever wakes up again, or what happens and why her eyes are purple, you have to read the book. So you can guess the purple is kind of an important color.
It's a pretty cover.
Thank you. So does anyone have any questions?
Who did your artwork?
I did. Well, I didn't draw it, but I created the cover on Canva.
Okay.
But yeah, I decided to go with kind of a silhouette look with the insects over it and the purple. So every cover of this series gives you clues to what's inside. So this one, it's got a girl, a butterfly in the purple color, and then the circular pattern in the background is important. So, any more questions?
I've been staring at it for a while, but I just now noticed the butterfly.
Yes.
I've been trying to figure out if that was her hair behind her or what. From here, my eyesight's not great right now.
Yeah.
But I just now picked up the
It's
butterfly.
supposed to be sort of blending into the background a little bit.